Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
I'm giving a presentation on the Woodlawn Cemetery, and for me to go through the history or through all the tombstones or to talk about everything in the cemetery, it would take hours. So I kind of limited on the old grounds, kind of focused in on it, and number one, a little bit of the history on how this cemetery started. Well, I guess we know why it started, but how it started. And then I'll kind of morph into some of the people buried in the old grounds. The old grounds, by the way, are the ones right off of College Street, and as you top the hill, once you get to the top of the hill, then you know that you're out of the old grounds and into the new grounds, which are very old grounds too. So Woodlawn Cemetery, Wadsworth, Ohio, established 1817. So in 1814, that's when Wadsworth was started up with a couple of pioneering families that settled out here in Western Star, which is the county line road out here where the flashing stop sign is. I always tell the kids that, on Broad Street. And that was kind of the beginning of the birth of Wadsworth. It was also the birth of Western Star too, and we kind of survived and grew where Western Star didn't have that growth. Initially, they were much bigger on the scene than Wadsworth, but because of the rail station being located in Wadsworth, in the south end of Wadsworth, it kind of took the air out of the tires out of Western Star. So they quickly dwindled as we grew. So back in the day, 1814, 1817, Wadsworth was nothing more than a wilderness full of ancient trees, and the only trail that made it out here, made it to Wadsworth. It also went to Harrisville, and actually that town is older than Wadsworth because the trail kind of went through this property and ended up there as the first settlement. And then we kind of backed up and came here to Wadsworth, and again we settled there at Western Star. And the first family to live kind of to the close to town actually lived right about here, and that was Frederick Brown and his family. He built the first log cabin, and pretty much was located here, which is ironic because he worried about the kids not getting a good education, all the pioneering families. So he took a special trip back home out to Connecticut, loaded his wagon up with books, and brought it here and set up kind of a library in his log cabin. And here we are again, deja vu all over again. It's still a library, although back then he didn't call it a library. And but anyway, unfortunately for him, he and his wife had an infant daughter who passed away shortly after birth. And at that time, there was no place to bury her except out in the woods out back. And his brother stepped forth and said, I have a piece of property down the street here, I'm going to donate it. It's an acre of land. I'm going to donate it, and it can be designated as a cemetery for future deaths. And his brother was Owen Brown. And he lived up in Hudson with his son, John Brown. John Brown, yes, is the famous abolitionist that I guess his fame wasn't the most positive fame you could have. But so Owen Brown stepped forward and said, I'll donate that 1 acre of land. He said, but I am going to maintain, or I'm going to continue to hold on to the pastoral rights to it. In other words, he could lease out the land to somebody who wanted to use his pasture field. Well, it was nothing more than woods to begin with, but they started knocking down trees in order to bury people. And before long, there were multiple graves in there. In fact, the first burials were children. and they list them as age 1, and that was the minimum that they would put, even if they were stillborn or whatever. If they were buried there, they were 1 year old, unless they exceeded becoming 1 year old. So there were 5 children who died pretty straight away, Frederick Brown's daughter being one of them, and I believe he had twin children that also passed, so maybe the first 3 were his. And then the first adult was John Curtis, and he passed away in 1820, and he was just here visiting family members. He didn't even live here at the time, but now he's living here forever. And so this is the oldest picture I can find of the cemetery in my archives. And if you look closely, you can see it was a wooden sidewalk going down past it. And down at the very bottom of the hill, they had the entrance to it. And surrounding the entire, at least the old grounds, was a fence. And it was a wrought iron fence. And, you know, the big question was, why do they put fences around graveyards? The people inside can't get out, and the people on the outside don't want to get in. But regardless, they put the fences around, having to do back in the days of the mid-1800s, where grave robbers would raid the cemeteries after the burials. And why would they want a dead body? Does anybody know?
Medical purposes.
For medical purposes. And we did have medical doctors here in Wadsworth. Medical school, in fact, was over here where the old Citizens Bank was, and today is the real estate here on the corner, although that was 2 buildings ago. And it was Dr. Pardee who maintained a little medical school there, and he pretty much told his students, if you want to work on actual bodies, you need to find your own. And I'm not sure he gave them explicit directions on how to do it, but they would hire people to go down and bag the bodies. So they would get them after the funeral was over with and people left the cemetery that evening. The guys came in with their picks and shovels and dug up the graves and pulled the bodies, put them in bags, and before long they ended up somewhere in the medical school. And then a little bit later on, the cemetery took this view, and not sure when that, maybe early 1900s, it's kind of hard to tell. And then we have this view of it from old postcards, and pretty impressive looking. But back in that original picture, by the way, and it was kind of hard to see because it's black and white, they used to have like a little koi pond there at the entrance with a fountain. And so it's always been decorative. And in fact, the person who kind of wrote down some of the history of the, I found this article in an old newspaper. It was Albert Hinsdale wrote, and telling about the first adult passing away in 1820. And then there was a female who passed away shortly after. Her name was Julie Mills, and she married the Loomis, into the Loomis family. And his comment in the news article is, some of the best pioneer citizens had unmarked graves, or unmarked by monuments, he states. And men who did less have very impressive ones. So his little editorial comment, I guess. And he suggested at the time, before they had a name for the cemetery, because they didn't obviously call it the Brown Cemetery or anything, or Wadsworth Cemetery, his suggested names, and this was after it was up and running and they even added a couple of more plots of land. He said the original part, the old part, the part going up the hill, should be called the City of the Dead Cemetery. Then at the top of the hill, which was kind of phase 2, He suggested they call it God's Acre. And then finally, from there on out, he wanted them to name it Mortality Park. Well, it ended up being called Woodlawn Cemetery. And he did mention in there that the first time a hearse was used to haul the dead there was in 1855 by the Kramer family, and shortly after the Woopter family took over, or did a separate hearse. And they said before that they just pretty much loaded the coffin into a wagon, which was pretty rough. I'm sure the person riding it didn't complain, but they said the hearse was a lot smoother ride for all involved. And here's what Woodlawn looked like just a couple of years ago. I didn't have this picture dated, but I did take it obviously in the early spring, it looks like. And here's kind of the entrance that I took just a couple of days ago. So as you can see, shrubbery, overgrown shrubbery has been removed and flowers are being planted. And by the way, and I'll talk more about it, that organization is called the Friends of Woodlawn Cemetery. So the cemetery personnel has a hard enough time just keeping up with the weed eating and the mowing and the cleanup of branches, that type of thing. So the Friends of Woodlawn Cemetery is an organization that was put together to help with some of the other needs, plus giving out the history of it and just beautifying the cemetery. In fact, Albert Hinsdale was one of those original guys that was concerned about the looks of the cemetery, and he said it should be a park-like setting where people can go and enjoy going there and having picnics and that type of thing, which may sound a little bit weird now, but I can tell you in the history of Wadsworth, after the Civil War, when the local communities did a decoration day, which today we call Memorial Day, they would have a service here at a local church. It was, I think, usually the Methodist church when it was here where Central is today. And they would have the some type of church service, and then everybody would leave the church and they would have their wreaths and picnic baskets in tow, and they would all walk down the hill and walk into the cemetery, decorate. At that time it was more about the Civil War, but you did have the War of 1812. You had the French and Indian War, and you had the Revolutionary War people. And they would decorate their graves, spread out their blanket, and sit and have a picnic with the dead. So that tradition, like I say, started after the Civil War. Here's some old pictures I came across, or at least one old picture of 1910 of the Beck Street entrance. So they used to have a sign over top that, and that just simply said Wadsworth Cemetery. So our cemetery is a Union cemetery, and not because we're north of the South, but Union means it's union with the city and the township. So they became a union so that, I guess, more for tax purposes and funding purposes, the township as well as the city puts the money towards it to pay the employees. So if you see, or if somebody says, oh yeah, we have a Union cemetery, that just means they're combined. There's probably some other technical thing. So in 1910, the entrance looked like that, and in 2019, I took a picture of it. Again, the reason I know that that picture was taken in 1910 was easy, because if you look at the picture closely, which it's hard to do on this small set. Who'd ever thought this is a small set back in our days? There they are just starting to build this vault. So the stones were just starting to be delivered, and that was 1910 when that was built. Today, of course, the entrance looks like the bottom picture. So the next slide shows you what that what do you call it, a crypt, I guess you would call it, the Detweiler Leader Crypt. And that's an interesting structure in itself. It has bronze doors on it. You can see how green they are. And also they said that some of the stone, because those are full chunks of stone, some of them weighed up to 10 tons. One stone weighed 10 tons. I suspect it's that one there on the side, the right-hand side, that lengthy one. But the roof is all one piece of stone, or each side of the roof. So if you're out there again, check that out. Okay, so again, the first burial was the daughter of Frederick and Chloe Brown. This picture I took years ago when you could still almost read it. And unfortunately, it's been knocked down. It's down flush to the ground, and it's just in sad shape. So I don't think we're there yet. Deb, I know you're here. Has that been resurrected yet?
No, but that's the next one on our list.
Okay, and I'll talk about it later in the presentation. But so there are a lot of these stones that are laying flat on their backs and half buried into the ground because they've been broken off. And we'll be talking about that, Friends of the Woodlawn Cemetery. Our goal is to bring those back up and get them standing and get them repaired, well, as much of the repair that we can do ourselves. So the first burial, and here's another burial. This is the Loomis family. They were a popular name in town, usually associated with the coal mines, but Sherman Loomis, he was also a teacher in town, though, when there were log cabin schools, of course. And his wife, Laudemia, was also a teacher. But his first wife, Julia, she died earlier on in their marriage. And the reason I put this up here, although he's not buried in the old grounds, he's buried in God's acre, I guess you'd call it. But we had this partial tombstone over at the museum for the longest time. In fact, it's out in my car. I didn't have time to bring it in with all the commotion going on. So we've had this partial tombstone there at the museum, and if you read it close enough, it says Julia M., and it says wife of S. Loomis. And I think it was Fran who was freaking out, thinking that she was buried under the back porch. No, not really. But we couldn't figure out why we had this partial. Well, ironically, they just found a note in the museum when going through the files saying it came from the Hunsberger house. And the Hunsberger house is that next house to the left. What is it, gray now, dark gray? And that's where it was, which didn't help us any because we're still trying to figure out where Julia should be. And so I think I finally cracked the egg wide open because she's not there on the broken tombstone. She's with Sherman with the new tombstone. So you can see her name there, Julia M., Julia M. And these are the things that we're finding out, that people reburied their people in other plots. And so they had the old tombstone and they just got rid of it. And more than likely the carvers, the monument makers, probably took care of the old stone. And it looks like they pretty much just cut them in half and handed them out to people. I suspect the Hunsbergers at one time probably had like a bird bath or something that this set on, and she was flipped upside down and nobody knew the difference until they moved and thought, oh my gosh. So hers is just a recycled tombstone. But so Sherman must have had her removed from the old part of the cemetery and brought up here with his second wife, and so now they're a threesome. We won't go there. Okay, so just some names in the old part of the cemetery, you know, as you're walking through and looking at names. George Lyman, of course you would recognize that name because of Lyman Street being right here. And George did live right over here and pretty much owned the property from the library here all the way down to Sacred Heart, all the way to 261. So that was the farmland. And notice on his tombstone it said he was a soldier of the War of 1812, no question there. And he also, I read, where he had a barn where the KSC Hall is today, just up the street there on the corner of Maple and Lyman, and he invented his own match. So back then he messed with chemicals and came up with his own kind of stick match. I don't know whatever became of that, but I'm sure the barn burned down, and that was the end of those experiments. So, and then this tombstone, several years ago I went through, I had a hard time finding it. Number one, it's hard to read. Number two, it was leaned over at like a 45-degree angle. It was facing down. And when I finally figured out after laying on my back and taking pictures of it that it was Oliver Durham, it made me pretty upset because he was the first pioneer family, the Durhams and the Deans. And so anyway, we got him straightened out, and now he's somewhat clean and ready for business. And here's one, you may not recognize the name, although if you go down Amish country, every other farm has this name on the mailbox, Jacob Miller. But in this particular case, Jacob Miller was the pioneer that came in and built the house up by the high school. And so he built that house in the late 1830s. It was a brick house. They stuccoed over it when the brick started disintegrating about 100 years ago. And so he made the brick at the farm and dug out the clay and had his oxen or cows tromp through it with the straw and mix it up, and had some forms, baked the clay, and built that house. And you know, unfortunately it's going to have to go under the wrecking ball if the schools expand. It has been purchased, I think, by the Wadsworth City Schools. And people said, well, can't we move it? I think you go to move one brick out of that house, it's going to come tumbling down. It's unfortunately just not in a good condition at all. And George Lyman also had a son, Dr. C.N. Lyman. He lived down the street here on Broad Street across from the old post office, and he was actually good friends with McKinley. And McKinley gave a speech, political speech, off his front porch. So he's the third house, I believe it is, from the parking lot on the north side. And then we have Dr. George Pardee, and this is his obelisk memorial in the cemetery. And he was one of those medical doctors that, again, encouraged his students to come up with real bodies. And his brothers had built this building, which, again, where the old Citizens Bank is down here at the corner, or was. And so they called it the Stone Store. It was a general store downstairs, and then who knows what on the upstairs. We know that some dead bodies arrived there frequently, and it wasn't from UPS. So the picture down the lower left-hand corner, I kind of used judgment on this. That is the body snatchers. So again, because he being one of the doctors, also Dr. Lyman could have been involved in this. But again, it wasn't like they were doing something unethical. It's just that the state of Ohio did not have any means for doctors to work on any cadavers. You couldn't will your body. You couldn't do this. You couldn't do that. I'm sure some of the hobos and things that came in on the trains, they got off and something happened to them and they died, supposedly would go to the pauper's field. Some of them, I think, went to the second floor of the Stone Store. But anyway, it's a part of history that I guess they tried to do the best they could do under the circumstances. There are also some stories that I read where somebody died of a bad illness in town, and the doctor, really encouraged that after their death that an autopsy be performed so the doctors knew what actually killed the person. So if it was a disease or virus that they needed to know about, and the family didn't want any part of it, saying, good heavens, we don't want the dead to be cut up. And well, that person was served up on a table then a couple of days later, even though the family made concerted effort, that they said that they were going to, and that's what family members would do after they learned about grave robbers. They would say, okay, we're going to sit by the grave for the next 2 weeks, day and night, until they knew the body was not in a position to be able to be resurrected. And in this particular case, the family left during the day after the funeral to go back, and they were all scheduled to come back in the evenings. Well, they snatched it out right after they left. So here they went back for the next 2 weeks, sitting all night for nothing to guard over an empty grave. And that, by the way, is when you say you're working the graveyard shift. That's where this came from, because the graveyard shift was the people who sat and watched over and protected from the grave robbers. So Allen Pardee, so the Pardee name was a big name in Wadsworth, obviously Pardee Street. Allen Pardee, John Pardee, George the Dr. Pardee, and their monuments, a couple of them are right there going up the hill, and then there's a Pardee section at the top of the hill. These guys, unfortunately, I guess, died before they got into the section up there, or maybe the brother said, I don't want you in there with me, I feel uncomfortable with you. But regardless, they built a lot of the downtown, and the only structure that I'm aware of that they built that's still standing would be over here next to the Dolce, the old Strand Theater. To the right of it is the insurance company. That is still a wooden structure. I think the only wooden structure, except for St. Mark's Church, that's downtown. Now it's been covered up with siding, but all the structures downtown started out as being like houses or wooden structures, and then eventually taken down and replaced by brick structures, which was a lot more safe for a downtown, as Medina experienced twice in its history. Their whole town burned down because they had all wooden buildings there. That's why their downtown looks so perfect, because all the buildings have the same architecture, because they were all built at the same time, because they all burned down at the same time. So anyway, Allen's in there. A.M. and A.C. Beck, they're buried in the old grounds, and Beck Street, that was their farm, and so they developed that. At least A.M. did. His dad, A.C., also, well, they owned the property there where the Methodist Church is, and had a tannery there, and they produced leather goods, and then they also had a store downtown on Main Street that sold the leather goods. So that was kind of their claim to fame. And there's a picture of him. He eventually was a mayor of Wadsworth too. I don't see he has a leather belt on, but I can't see that low either. And this is kind of an interesting set of tombstones. You have Michael, E-A-L, and Michael, A-E-L. That's father and son. And the father fought in the Revolutionary War, and the son fought in the War of 1812. They're at the top of the hill on the right. They're clean now, and I'll show you a little bit later. I think I have a picture of them. Their tombstones are clean and bright white instead of this nasty color. Here's the Hinsdale family plot, And they were a pretty prominent family in Wadsworth. They lived up around Clark's Corners or up on Reimer Road, some of the early pioneering type. And their children went to a one-room schoolhouse, and the one-room schoolhouse is still there across from that church. And the one that does touch a truck across from there. What's the name of that church?
The old Northside Church? It's called Now Church.
The Now Church? Okay. Well, anyway, but there's an old one-room schoolhouse still existing there. People live in it. It's a brick one, and if you're not looking for it, you'll probably miss it. They have evergreen shrubs in the front that kind of cover up the front, but anyway, they were educated there, and it was a very prosperous family at the end. Albert Hinsdale, the father of the ones I'm going to show you here, he's the one that wrote up, was active with the cemetery board, and so he had several children. I think his daughter, which I don't have a picture of, she was a teacher in Wadsworth in one of the, probably the one-room schoolhouses. Then there was Burke and also Wilbert. They went on to be professors in universities up in that state up north, whatever you call it. And but very prestigious. Well, I mean, they became very professorized and educated, and it's just interesting to see how people grow out of their element and get into this sort of thing. They also had a son, George. I don't have a picture of him. He's the one who designed the architecture for both the First Christian Church and St. Mark's Church. So the Disciple Church and the Congregationalist Church. And that was back in the 1840s. They were both constructed 1842, and sadly, his was the first funeral that took place in the First Christian Church or the Disciple Church in, I think, 1843. I never did figure out what got him. He was only like 28 years old. I found his obituary, but it never mentioned what he died from. And then you'll see a lot of Mills. Do we have Mills family people here from, I know the one lady from the Friends of Woodlawn Cemetery, she's related to the Mills family. But Mills Street, just down the street here, or over by Central, across from Central, it was named after Harry Mills, who lived on the house right across from Central on the corner of Mills and Main. So there was no Mills structure down on that street. It was named after the guy, just like Pardee was named after the family. So his monument, as well as other Millses, are in there. Oh, and this is the statue, the Civil War statue, and he started out back in 1912 there in the gazebo square. And during renovations of 1949, when they redid the downtown, when people get all shook up saying, why are you redoing the downtown? This downtown has been redone I don't know how many times. So he got hauled down the road, and interesting enough, in that 1912 picture in the lower part, you'll see it looks like a bathtub. Well, that was the horse trough for the people coming in their horse and buggies back in the 1800s. And that horse trough, by the way, is in the front of the museum with flowers in it today. So if you see that kind of bathtub-looking structure and say, why would you put that ugly thing out there? It's a horse trough. It's just full of flowers and dirt. So anyway, he got hauled down there. They nicknamed him Colonel Randall. And the story behind it is Colonel Randall was the city director back in the 60s, I believe it was. But anyway, during that time, vandals got into the cemetery and they hauled the poor guy off his pedestal. And he came crashing down. He was in a bunch of pieces, and he ended up in the one of the city garages for the longest time, all mangled. And so you had the pedestal there with nothing on it except no remains at all. And people complained about it, wanted the statue back, and during one of the heated council meetings, because they didn't want to spend the money, of course it's Wadsworth, they didn't want to spend the money, and finally somebody said, well, who is that guy anyway? And one of the council members stood up and saluted the city director, and he said, his name's Colonel Randall. And since he thought it was named after him, he said, okay, let's get him fixed. And of course, we had the time capsule buried there in 1964. And the picture there on the right shows it being buried. There was a stone on top that explained that, that it was to be opened in 2014. And it was opened in 2014. And then in 2015, yes?
The little boy in the front pointing is my brother.
The little boy in the front.
Back to the time capsule.
There we go.
Little boy over there pointing?
Oh, yeah.
What's he pointing at?
I don't know.
Who is it?
That's my brother.
Well, what's his name?
George Dayfo.
Oh, okay, George Dayfo.
And I'm right behind him.
Well, I know George. I went to school with him. Yep.
And I'm right behind him, the head behind him.
That head, you're the big giant head behind him. Okay, well, that's cool.
That was all of our neighbors.
All right, well, I don't see George in the next picture, but I don't see anybody. So, so this time capsule was buried in 2015 and needs to be opened again in what, 2064, 50. I think they said 50 years from 14. So it'd be 64, 2064. How many people plan to attend that one? Right now it's not on my bucket list, so. Well, anyway, so that was the old time capsule refilled with things, and this is the school's time capsule that was filled with things from the school and kids. So hopefully, especially when they were just kindergartners, first, second, young kids, they'll be able to see it unburied. Then we have the William Pitt Curtis Monument, and that's the one that faces the street. And I'm going to watch my time. So the story behind it is, there's always stories. And I know as a kid I always wondered, who is that lady and why is she standing there with an anchor in her hand? And I didn't learn the story until I finally heard about the story. So the Curtis family lived across the street in an old Western Reserve type house, kind of where old Holmesbrook lumber is today, Ruby Moon for some of you. And that was their original house. And William Pitt Curtis was a chemist or a pharmacist. He originally came from Seville, and he came to Wadsworth and opened up a pharmacy here. And he and his wife and their son Willie lived in the house across the street. Later on in life, they did switch out the house, just like we lost a lot of Western Reserve houses because people wanted to upgrade, and that was his upgrade. And parts of this house still exist across. It's at the corner of Kyle and College. It's the one with the building that juts out to the corner where I always remember Johnny Motorcycle Shop used to be. But the house is still in the back. The reason it's not identifiable is because the turret, the tower, whatever you want to call that, is gone. And when they added that building, they ripped off the porch and just kind of put it in that 90-degree angle. So this is gone, and then that block building comes out from it. So if you look close enough, you'll be able to see it. Took me years to figure that one out. So anyway, getting back to them. So they lived across the street there, And the dad had his pharmacy in the building next to the old Strand Theater, the insurance building there on the right. So in one of these, either this store, this store, or this store, I'm not sure which one it was, that's where his drugstore was. And so simply just lived up the street from it. So his son Willie, 10 years old, he loved to go visit Dad up at the drugstore because Dad would give him candy, of course. And so Willie would take his wagon and drag his wagon up College Street to downtown and visit Dad there, because Willie knew the most fun part of the trip was going home, because he could go down the hill and end up there right in front of his house. Now, this was back in 1875, and so the cemetery, again, going back to the old picture, would look more like this. Had the fencing around it, had the entrance to it, had a gate to open up, and that was probably his playground at one time. Just run across the street and go play over there. So he gets on his wagon to go home and jumps on it out here, probably in front of St. Mark's Church, and starts down the hill. And back then the hill was much steeper than what it is now. They've graded it down for vehicles as opposed to just buggies and that type of thing. And on this day he went a little bit faster than expected, and the wagon kept getting faster and faster and faster and faster. And suddenly, towards the end, he started losing control of it. And then, boom! He crashed into the open gate. Somebody had left the gate open, and the closer went into his stomach. So he was impaled there, blood gushing out. Mom hearing the scream across the street. She came running over. The doctor up the street, and they called him down, and they did get him into the house and got the bleeding under control. But that was back in 1875, before they knew about infections and before they had penicillin. So Willie eventually succumbed to his accident. And now they say that late at night, when there's no traffic out there on College Street, you can hear the faint sound of a wagon, metal wheels on dirt coming down the road. And suddenly at the end you'll hear a boom when he hits the gate. And that's when the sound leaves. So by the Curtis Monument you'll see Willie L., son of William Pitt and A.L. Curtis, died November 26th. This is something to share at the Thanksgiving table this year. Then, of course, we have the most famous monument in the cemetery, and that's the one that was erected in the memory of Sylvia Beach, who was lost in the woods and never found. So I don't want to go through that whole story. Let me tell you, I have a video out on it, so I don't have to give you the whole story. Go to WCTV website and go to where you can watch videos, and on there it'll have, actually I think it says Ghost Story Part 1. May say Sylvia Beach on it, but I do a whole narration on it, and they'll scare the bejesus out of you. But if you look at it, this monument was erected in her memory in 1824. So the dates don't quite correlate. 1823 is what it says in the history book. Yes?
I was really excited to come tonight to find out the story behind this.
Yeah?
Can you just give me a little bit?
Just a little bit.
Just a teeny bit of history.
Okay. The only reason she came was to hear the... Okay, so the Beach family came to Wadsworth, early pioneers, 1823, same year, and they settled out on the Hayne Farm, which is out Akron Road, Route 261. Go up High Street, and you go to leave town, and you start going down the hill, down to Bent Creek. On the left-hand side, it's still farmland there. That's the Hain farm, and that's where the Beaches landed with, and they built their log cabin. That's the first thing that you did, chop down trees, blah, blah, blah. They had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter, Sylvia. And Sylvia was right around 23 years old, and as a little child she had scarlet fever, contracted scarlet fever. So she lost her ability to talk and she lost her hearing. And also that came with having a type of seizure, and her seizures looked like she would suddenly burst out running for no reason at all. I mean, except the fact she was having a seizure. So she would take off running with no direction and whatever. So the one day she and her mom were gathering up wood to take into the log cabin, and Mom kind of stayed with her all the time because, again, she was there to protect her. And so the mom walked in with her load of wood first and set it down by the fireplace, and of course the cabin door slammed behind her, and she turned around to help Sylvia. Sylvia's not there. And so she opened up the door and looked outside. Where's Sylvia? And she can't yell for her, of course, because Sylvia can't hear. So she went around the cabin looking for her. Couldn't find her. Went back into the cabin, went up to the loft, looked every square inch around, couldn't find her. So she shouted out to the boys and her husband, they were out in the barn, to come help search for Sylvia. She's missing. So they joined in the search. They looked around. Now, back then, the log cabin was newly built, so all the brush from the trees, all the branches, were all stacked up around the cabin. And so they thought, well, she's not going to run very far. She's going to run into, you know, a big branch heap. So they started tearing through those things and pulling out the branches. Well, the one son found an opening in the brush pile. And so he called everybody over. He said, this opening, I bet she's in there. She crawled back in there. And so he himself went in, and he got down on his hands and knees, and he's crawling in there, crawling in there, crawling in there. Finally, oh my gosh! He jumps back. He comes charging out. It was nothing more than a wild rabbit that they came shooting out of the hole. And she wasn't there, obviously. But it scared the bejesus out of him at that time.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes at 9 o'clock.
All right, we have a 30-minute warning. That's better than a 2-minute warning. Okay, so she's not in the brush heap. So now it's starting to get dark. It's March. That's the time of year it was. And so it was fairly cold out. In fact, there was a dusting of snow out there. And getting dark early. So they told the boys to go down to the next farm and get help. And help is just somebody to volunteer to help search. Well, the closest farm to them was the Isles farm, or Eels, or however you pronounce her name, at the intersection of Hartman and Akron Road, where the stoplight is. That was their closest neighbor. Then the next neighbor was probably another half mile around. But anyway, they collected several families, or at least the men and boys in the family, to come back to the house to help search. And fortunately, they did find her footprints in the snow. So from what I can figure out, just reading and the directions that they gave, I think she kind of went down to the bottom of the hill where Bent Creek goes through, and that creek is the one that extends all the way to Derling Park, and then past Sacred Heart, behind the Methodist Church, goes all the way to the south end. So they picked up her tracks there, searched most of the night, and then finally had to take a break and said, you know what, let's just meet back here right before the sun comes up. We'll catch the tracks, blah, blah, blah. They did that. And they reconvened, and even had some other helpers to come because, you know, they wanted to spread out a little bit. just to make sure that they were covering the grounds. And so they went back and they picked up where they left off, found the tracks, kept following. The sun came up and her tracks disappeared. And quite frankly, that was the last they saw of anything associated with Sylvia, as her footprints melted away. They never found any clothing, they never found any blood, they never found any signs of anything of what could have happened to her. They searched throughout the week, and finally after the end of the week they did a major search, and this time it was a search for a body. And so they got as many volunteers as they could, which unbelievably back then amounted to 600 people came to Wadsworth from Seville, from Doylestown, Rittman, Sharon Center. All the area communities, all the men and boys came in, and they made basically a human line from Holmesbrook Park all the way to the Hayne Farm, or to the beach farm, and they marched everybody forward in a long line using horns as signals, and still never found anything. So what part of the story do you want to hear?
Well, I always thought that she was in Durling Park, so.
That's where they last, where I calculated where she was last seen.
So I
Or
grew
her.
up on Highland, so that was the
Yes.
story when I was a girl.
Well, so then you know that if you would go to Durling Park on one of those cold and misty days where the fog is settled in the valley, you'll see an apparition that then a girl dressed in a pioneer outfit, you'll see it, all white, but you have to catch her before she goes into the culvert pipe that goes under Sacred Heart. Otherwise, you'll have to find her on the other side of the Methodist Church where it comes out. Wow. I figure that a year after, I don't know, either the history book was written incorrectly, that should have said 1824 instead of 1823, but I've gone back and rechecked it.
It also says April.
Yeah. Well, whatever date they came up with, I don't know whether how they came about it, but oh, and the one other thing, you'll see that this looks pretty clean, no pun intended, but the original engraving is on the back of this tombstone. So when you go there, you can see the old part, which is getting badly worn, and it sounds like the cemetery board had it taken out at one time and re-engraved, because it is, I suppose they got tired of trying to point out which tombstone it was and finally said, let's engrave that sucker so anybody can read it, so they're not so it's easier to point them to. But it's right along the sidewalk, about halfway up the front entrance on the right hand side, and you can either see it coming or see it going. And there's also that statue up at the top of the hill, and that was, they call that the John McGregor Monument. And John McGregor was a teacher of the Wadsworth Academy, and an academy back in those days before 1870 was the equivalence to a high school education, because prior to that you only had to go up to whatever 8th grade and you were done. And some of the richer people in town wanted their kids to get like an academy education so they could go on to college to be doctors, lawyers, and such. So this guy taught the Wadsworth Academy. They even built a building for him. It was an octagonal building, and it was located where the Trinity Church is today. Wooden structure. And in 1870, when they finally passed laws in Ohio that high schools were now funded, blah, 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 he retired before then and had moved to Massillon. But anyway, he eventually died just like everybody else does, and he had a simple tombstone in the cemetery, And his former students spotted it one day, and by now they're all doctors and professionals, and the one guy thought, well, he was such a great teacher, why did they put such a simple tombstone there? So he contacted all the prior classmates and things like that, and they took up a collection. And I know this is an old postcard. This was the dedication ceremony. You can hardly see the statue, so I'll give you more. There's a close-up of what it originally looked like. I don't have the whole thing on that picture. I wanted to show the detail of how he's standing there with a book and he's pointing in the book. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like that today. It was vandalized years ago, and now he just has stubs for hands and no book to be found. But that's what he looks like, and according to certain people who believe in this, that if you're walking past him, his eyes will always follow you, like the Mona Lisa. So, look over your shoulder and see whether he's still watching you. But he was originally from Scotland, and he escaped Scotland with some of his other friends as they were trying to overthrow at least kick the English out of Scotland, let's put it that way. And so he eventually found his way to Wadsworth. And there's a story here about Mary Blocker, a 10-year-old. This is Deb Holcomb's favorite tombstone. She has just been enthralled with this tombstone. Now, if you look at it, I took this picture years ago when it was laying on its back, pushed down into the ground, mowers running over poor Mary, and today she's in much better shape. She's back on her feet, and she's clean, and Deb is proud that she cleaned Mary Blocker's. But Mary Blocker was a child of 10 years old when she passed away. And she attended the old two-room schoolhouse that used to be where Save-A-Lot parking lot is today. And when that schoolhouse went out of commission, they moved it over to North Part E, where it still stands today. It's a duplex now. But anyway, Mary attended there. And back in those days, and this was, I think, right before this got hauled down, the place was wooded. There wasn't a whole lot to play on, but they did have a rope swing. And so Mary got on the rope swing, and she was swinging back and forth, having a good old time. The boys were pushing her, and she kind of, well, she enjoyed the whole journey until the branch broke and came plummeting down, crushing her skull, and she was then taken to the old grounds for burial. Now, this one is a weird one because, as you know, that school's there at Save-A-Lot, and up the street from is where they built that log cabin on Prospect. That log cabin came from southern Ohio. It's not a Wadsworth log cabin. And when I was principal at Lincoln School, I'd have kids that would say, "Oh, Mr. Haynes, we were on our way to school today and somebody followed us." And I go, "Yeah, okay. So what's the big deal about that?" "Well, we turned around, there was nobody there." And I said, "Well, then how you know somebody was following you?" "Well, we could hear this person behind us." So they'd give me these stories about somebody following them up Prospect and down High Street. But every time they turned around, there was nobody there. I didn't think a whole lot about it until this paranormal came into town, and this kid in town that supposedly had these powers. And this was years after I was at Lincoln. And he was talking about this ghostly type paranormal, I don't know what you call them. And he felt the presence down in that same area that those kids talked about. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, maybe they were right, you know, maybe I should listen better. But I slept better at night knowing that I didn't think it was anything. So thinking about all that, now I'm thinking it was Mary Blocker going back to school, and she sees the log cabin. That's the closest thing that she can see that looks like her old school. So think about that one. Maybe you'll have the nightmares. Okay, getting back to the cemetery, Spanish-American War, we have a monument there, and so it's a granite stone, and embedded in there is a plaque saying that this is a memorial to those that fought in the Spanish-American War, blah, blah, blah. And that is the porthole cover to the battleship Maine that blew up in Havana Harbor. So, evidently, that battleship has pieces and parts all over the United States. It was kind of trendy that cemeteries would get a piece or part. We ended up with a porthole cover. So that's our claim to fame nationwide. Wadsworth, a home of a porthole cover. We have the mausoleum there that was built in 1912 by the Hilliard and Curry undertakers, funeral cabinet makers, etc. They were located on Main Street there, close to where Bixler's just closed up. And interesting enough, and we open that right around 4th of July for public viewing. I suppose if you have somebody in there, you can get the key and go in and check them out. But interesting enough, a significant number of the people in there died, and I suspect it was from the Spanish flu. A lot of dates of 1914, 1915, and in fact there's people who died prior to that mausoleum even being built. I keep thinking, well, they died in 1910. This thing wasn't built until 1912. So again, they must have been built or buried out in the grounds and then taken out and then put on the shelf in there. So anyway, I do give the board credit for cleaning up that. It was badly, soiled over the years and dark black streaks all over it, and they had it professionally cleaned, and it looks beautiful. As you know, Decoration Day, Memorial Day, and the ceremony is held down at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, located there towards what I guess would be the middle between College Street and the mausoleum. And that has different battle names from the Civil War around its base. And then we also have the plaque there to notate the Revolutionary War people who were buried there. There's 4 buried in Wadsworth Cemetery. It also lists 4 of them that are buried at Western Star Cemetery. And Western Star did have 5, and we had 3, but then somebody had their guy moved to balance out Wadsworth, so we got Elisha Hinsdale, the father of Albert and grandfather of those kids I mentioned earlier. So we're at least not outdone by Western Star. And here's another picture of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then this part of it, I just went through the other day just taking pictures of some unique looking memorials, and I really don't know any of these people, but it's interesting how these monuments are changing and getting faces engraved in them. This is a quilt and a car, their favorite car. This is an older one, but let me point out on here, and I don't know, does my arrow come up there or not? No. But this is down close to the office building there, and it's the Cahoon, C-A-H-O-O-N. But just to show you, this is a piece of the monument. These are separate pieces. These are separate pieces, and that's a separate piece. And in fact, if somebody would go there and just give it a good shove, it would all just fall apart like a jigsaw puzzle. So that's the way monuments are put together. There are various pieces that are stacked on each other, usually adhesive done to them, but over the years the adhesive doesn't work anymore, and that's why tombstones fall apart and fall over. There's the Renaissance. That one's interesting because it looks like that has drawers in it that they're going to push the bodies into, so it's above ground. This is the Artman. This is the witch's hat. And the witch from River Styx is buried under there. Don't touch this one, please. I won't take any responsibility. This one you can't read because of the smallness of it, but it's interesting in that it's all written in Polish. So these immigrants that came to Wadsworth that worked in the factories, some of those tombstones down there are in Hungarian and Italian, and this one is in Polish. And this one, nothing real fancy about, but this is where Big Andy was buried. And how many people been around when Big Andy was in downtown? I wasn't. But Big Andy was this pretty huge guy. He was from Russia, and he basically lived out of refrigerator boxes down in the square and just went around collecting scrap and doing weird stuff like that. And I guess he was just a huge Russian guy that didn't talk to anyone, blah, blah, blah. The reason I put it on there is, how do a guy like that nobody seemed to know and lived in a refrigerator box end up with a monument that's huge?
Which one is his?
His is the center one.
The center.
Yeah. And it's located close to the Hunsberger and the Detweiler vaults, kind of in that area. And this is interesting because, as you can see, nothing. This is a whole empty space in kind of the secondary part. College Street is out here. You're up at the top of the hill, and you see no tombstones in that area. Well, that's been identified as Block 4 on the cemetery map, but that's where the black people were buried from Wadsworth. And they know that people were buried there because there's sinkholes all over. And from the old timers I talked to, they always say, oh yeah, that's where the blacks were buried. And they were in unmarked graves. So I put Annie Lee's picture in there, and this is Julia Williams, another. So the black people came from Virginia during the coal miners' strike here against the Loomis mines, and he just sent people down there to recruit black people, told them that they were going to make all this money mining coal, and they all jumped on the opportunity. This was right after the Civil War. Of course, the former slaves didn't have any jobs, and they came up here, and little did they know they were strike breakers. Some of them, and you know, the white people threatened to kill them and that sort of thing, so they had a compound built to put them in over in Hametown, on Hametown Road, pretty close to that old stone jail intersection. Dana Miller's nut shop is there, and so they had to protect them, and then in the morning they would leave the compound and go down the street or down in the valley to catch the train spur to take them to the Wadsworth mines to work. So the black families then pretty much congregated and lived in the neighborhood down here across from the cemetery, Kyle and Mill Street. But interesting. Okay, here's some other mysteries. So the one mystery is solved, and that was this Julia Loomis. This is a mystery. This is part of the McCoy part that's at the top of the hill. And when we remove the tombstone, because we reset these and level everything, and I flip this over, and it has, I don't know whether that's V1 and IV, but it had markings on it. Some kind of Roman numerals. I don't know what it meant. But anyway, those are some strange things we come across. And some of the other tombstones had those markings too. So, and then when we were straightening up a tombstone, this was really weird. We ran into this guy. He was buried down next to the tombstone we were trying to pull out and straighten. And it was, at first, I just thought it was broken stone that they put in to help brace it because maybe it leaned before. Then I found out it was a dead guy in there. And so then then I thought, you know what? This was a tombstone mistake. Who names their kid He-Man? He-Man Hatchet. And I thought, his name was Herman Hatchet, and they just, you know, made a mistake and they busted up and used it as filler. Then we find out somebody on the in the Friends of Woodlawn Cemetery Googled him. He's not even buried in Wadsworth. He's buried in River Styx. So we think what happened, the same thing as what happened to Julia, is he was originally buried in Wadsworth, and they decided, you know what, we're going to do a family tombstone. That's his tombstone now, over there with other family members, and so they just hauled him out and took him over there and took the old tombstone and made it into a bird bath step. And Deb Holcomb did this. This is a way that you can read tombstones without damaging them. Take a piece of foil and put over top and rub it out softly. Would you use
What sponge? Like makeup sponge?
I don't know about that, but some kind of sponge. So anyway, this one we couldn't read. She rubbed it out. I took a picture of it. We figured out what it said, because it said this guy was killed in a collision, and it was, what, 1882 it looks like. And no, actually he was born in 52. Anyway, and again, I think it was you that found it in an old newspaper article because you have a service that you are enrolled in. And so he was killed in a train accident down in Ashland, right?
I think so.
Yeah. With the switchers, somebody switched the train when they weren't supposed to switch it, and he was the engineer and smacked into the back end of another train when he had gotten the go-through. Okay, now, Friends of the Woodlawn Cemetery. I just put these bullet points down. They're into restoration, preservation, rehabilitation, and enhancement of the cemetery, as well as historical education. So here's some people at work. This guy actually came and trained us how to help with these tombstones. The guy in the upper two pictures, and also the last picture. And there's some high school kids helping us clean, and I think in that case I think they were ready to clean. Some of the tools there, those red sticks down at the bottom, those are just plastic putty knives. Don't want to use metal to stone, but plastic or wood's okay. And here's a before and after shot of the same stone. And in fact, it's better than that. This is an older picture. Right when we first clean it, it kind of starts looking rusty. But after days and days and days, it'll completely be bleached out white. Here's what we call a resetting, and Mary Blocker is in one of those. Okay, 10 minutes.
The library is closing in 5 minutes.
5. That's all right. How is she going to throw us out? So all these tombstones were basically laying on their backs, down in the ground. We pulled them up out, leveled everything, and put them in a straight row as much as we could. And in fact, even in Albert Hinsdale's recollections of the cemetery, they said they just started burying people randomly with no sense of direction in the old part. So Deb, that kind of answers that question. We wonder, why are some facing the south? Why are some facing the north? Why are rows going north and south and other rows are going east and west? He said it was a big mess back then, so it wasn't our fault. All right, this is actually Ann Hudson. She wanted to clean one of her relatives' stones, so she's there in the upper right-hand corner. And it started out there on the far left. That's the same tombstone. And then after she was done cleaning, down there at the bottom. Here I did a close-up of the top of this one monument. and lichens and green algae, blah, 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 on the left. After done cleaning, on the right. There's another tombstone. Same thing. Cleaned up. Here's one that got reset because it was leaning backwards pretty significantly, and now it's nice and straight and clean. Here's one that was, or two of them, that were broken, snapped off, and you can, I marked where the seam is on this one, and now it's even covered up more with some stuff we put on so you can't even see the seam. And here you can see where this one's glued together. This was an old sandstone one. There's not a whole lot we can do to help these things. Once they disintegrate, they're gone, but we at least got them up on its feet, or its back, or its front, whatever. And future projects. There's a bunch of them. You can see all these tombstones, blah, blah, blah. Leaning, laying on their backs, broken, need glued back together, or epoxied rather. The Frederick Brown one down in the lower left-hand corner. Here's one that's really has a challenge with the tree. That one they're going to have professionally moved. That one, the tree root keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the Mills family keeps sagging and sagging. And what's bad about it is, again, the monuments are in several pieces. In this one, it's a two-piece. This is separate from the base, and this is actually slid about an inch on the base. It's ready. A teenager could crawl up on top of that and topple it with no problem. And if the thing falls on them, they'll be killed instantly. The things weigh a ton. So they're going to have to bring in some major equipment to get it sorted out. And this is a neighboring cemetery. I won't name the community, but this is what their cemetery looks like. And we don't want ours to look like that.
I can guess. Norton.
I didn't say it, but you're warm. Maybe even hot. Okay, Deb Holcomb is here to answer any of your questions if you want to become a member. We need people to help. We're just trying to do the old section, and we've been working all summer, and it feels like we've made significant progress, but I keep thinking this is just a small part of the whole cemetery, and to save it, you know, and people with some muscle that can muscle around these stones. They are not light at all when you have to lift them out and clean them and put them back to reset them, or you have to dig out their base and roll them to the side, and then we gravel the bottoms. One last thing before she yells at us.
7 o'clock and the library is now closed. Please exit through the door in the stairwell.
Okay, last thing, cemetery walks. I'm going to do one Friday, September 24th, 6 o'clock. Meet at St. Mark's in the front of St. Mark's. Friday, September 24th, and Saturday, October 2nd. Those are the two that I have set up. So write them down. You just show up, and then we take a walkabout. They last about 2 hours. And it sounds like a long time, but after 2 hours you think, oh my gosh, we've been gone for 2 hours. By then you'll be ready to go to the brewery, though.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.